Greetings, students. Michael Zabirian here, and I thought I would shoot a quick lecture video on the protest movements and its political ramifications in the 1960s. So let's go to the PowerPoint. Okay, so we're going to divide this up into the Kennedy years, the election of Johnson, and then different protest cultures that emerge and the reaction to those protest cultures. So let's start with the election of 1960. Kennedy is elected in one of the lowest margin races of American history. And I'm going to magnify this, if I can get the pointer to go up. Right, magnify slide, here we go. So here's your vote count. You will notice that Kennedy only bested Nixon popular vote by about 200,000, a very small margin. And if you look at the electoral map, it's actually a close spread. You'd think that a 100 elector lead is big. Not really. That's only about 3 states, 3 large states. And the 3 large states were, really it's about 2, because if I combine Texas and Illinois, that's 52 states right there. And with 52 states, or sorry, that's 52 electors. If Kennedy loses 52 electors, now he's in the 250s. If Nixon goes up by 52 electors, he's getting close to 273 or 271. And then, of course, Harry Byrd from carried 15 electors, primarily from Mississippi and Alabama. Even with the Byrd candidacy, you begin to see some rumblings of the South having its own independent political notions separate from the mainline Democratic Party, which has become dominated by urban machine politics and liberal intellectuals. Now, it was a close election. There was some allegations, rumors of voter fraud in Illinois and Texas. Allegations that dead people voted. It was a common enough joke to say back in the 1960s through the 1970s, when I die, I want to be buried in outside of Chicago so I can be active in Democratic Party politics. Kennedy comes into office in a divided country that is slightly less than thrilled to have him, having had the great unifying presidency of Eisenhower. And he comes into a world in certain degrees of disarray. You have Kennedy's failure to contain communist aggression in Europe. The Soviets build the Berlin Wall. You have the failed invasion with the Bay of Pigs, and that is blaming the Kennedy administration. You have people in Florida on pins and needles after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so his foreign policy readily could be described as disadvantageous to an abject failure. Then Kennedy, who was definitely tied more in tune with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, he's a New England Irishman, did not, he continued the work that the Eisenhower administration did on civil rights with desegregation of public institutions. But again, that causes his coalition, which includes Southern Democrats, to become frayed. And so one of the reasons why Kennedy finds himself, and this is James Meredith, who I've alluded to in a previous lecture, sitting alone at Ole Miss. Here's Kennedy at Love Field in Dallas. Part of the reason Kennedy is in Dallas is to try and shore up support in the American South, because he knows that his civil rights policies are alienating traditional people in the South. He's trying to drum up support in the South, which was why he was at a series of speaking events in Dallas, which was where ultimately he was assassinated. This is people reading about Kennedy's assassination in November of '63. So Johnson, as the vice president, not only takes the mantle of the president, he also takes the mantle of party leader. Now, Johnson had run against Kennedy back in 1960. They were both vying for the Democratic Party nomination. Johnson gets the vice presidency, and many of the older hands in the Democratic Party were skeptical of giving the presidency to a younger president. So Johnson takes over the campaign organization. Johnson is up against Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater breaks the conservative coalition or the Republican coalition. So the Republican Party had its, what we could probably say as an Eisenhower progressive wing, and then you had the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party that really wanted to undo many of the social welfare machinations, even going back to the New Deal. There are still old hands in the Republican Party who want to repeal parts of the old deal as an overarching intrusion into American life. If you think about it, the Social Security tax is, again, it's a tax on everyone who's working. That's a sign of an expansive federal government. The other thing is the abject spending, which many of the conservatives view as wasteful. And so one of the things that Goldwater, who is the former governor of Arizona, who's the first Jewish person to run for the presidency or to gain a major party nomination, is he champions states' rights and individual autonomy. Well, this notion of individual autonomy and deferring to the states resonates quite well in the southern communities, which have designs, especially as they're having the Civil Rights Act being solicited upon them. And the Civil Rights Act, as I said in my previous lecture, forces individual business owners to conduct business with people that previously they had not. And so one of the things that, desegregating the lunch counters and the hotels and the restaurants did was it has now the federal government forcing commerce on private business, which, okay, on the one hand, you have the people who thought of it in the racial context, but also on the other hand, you have people who look at it as, wait, in the name of civil rights, you're electing the government to have an authoritarian relationship over individual behavior in commerce, and where does it end? Okay, this idea that it's a march towards totalitarianism. So here's a, in your heart, you know he's right, vote for Barry Goldwater. These are segregationists in the 60s who are still not happy about desegregation and civil rights that is going on in the American South. And here's what winds up happening in the election of 1964. Goldwater, and let's see if I can go to the pointer. Goldwater carries his home state. Now, one of the things that needs to be contextualized, Goldwater's a libertarian. One of the things, and Arizona doesn't have a tradition of segregation. Arizona doesn't have, in the 1960s, a statistically significant African-American population. Arizona never engaged in plantation agriculture. But what's remarkable is that notion of removing the government from people's individual lives resonates well in the Deep South. And so you have this block of southern states voting for a Republican candidate for president for the first time since Reconstruction. And so that begins the process where southern states go from being one-party Democrat states, where they consistently vote for the Democrats as a bloc, to being states with nominally Democratic leadership at the state and congressional level, but voting for Republican presidential candidates. This will continue and become more consistent across time after the election of 1968, really in the election of 72. Now, starting in the early 60s, as early as 1962, but then gaining more momentum and more notoriety, are the social protest movement. You have the New Left, which advocates for it's an anti-authoritarian left, and a lot of it emerges in the college campuses, where one of the things that hasn't happened yet is, okay, the baby boomers go to campus. They are the largest generation at that point in American history. Actually, we haven't matched birth rates with the baby boom yet. But the baby boom goes to college. They go to college at 18. Law in the United States has legal adulthood at 21. Legal adulthood has been 21 for most of American history, but people matriculate into college as technically minors. And what had happened at the universities was previously the arrangement was if you were not 21, if you were not a legal adult, the college ruled over you in the place of the parent. And so you have people on college campuses protesting not only for their own rights to speak, they're protesting the mores of the college, they're protesting the sexual mores that are imposed by the colleges, most of whom have their rules and institutions set up back in the Victorian era. And embedded in that is a sort of anti-authoritarian free speech and free speech movement that is also against the Vietnam War. And the presence of the Vietnam War and its draft further aggravated it. So here we have the free speech movement at Berkeley. And now we get into the counterculture. Countercultural was the rejection of authority and that idea of you're going to go to college, you're going to go to work. And, you know, part of that was the individual is free to express themselves in a variety of ways. They're free to express themselves outside of traditional religion. They're free to express themselves physically through varied forms of sexuality. They're free to express themselves physically in terms of the consumption of drugs. And you also have them being distrustful of the authority, especially as it came to the war machine in Vietnam. Now, those countercultural individuals find allies in the anti-war movement by certain Christian denominations that either tended to be absolutely pacifistic, and then you have some intellectuals who are against the war because it's not in America's strategic interest. So here's Timothy Leary, who's promoting the use of LSD. And again, a lot of this is coming out of California. Again, California at this point is not the most populous state. You have more people moving into it. Here you have a poster for Woodstock. And so having seen protest movements on the issue of race, on the issue of the war, then you begin to see a plethorizing of protest movements across multiple domains. So one of which is now the second wave feminism, which first begins protesting for equal pay for equal work, whereas previously many employers often differentiated pay in between men and women because the expectation was that a single woman was working to augment her income, whereas a man would be working towards as a householder, taking care of a family, things like that. One of the other things that's been a dimension of this second wave of feminism of equal pay for equal work would have been more inclusion of women in the workplace. Now, one of the things we're going to get into further down the timeline is by expanding women's role in the workforce, one of the things that's kind of happened is you double the size of the workforce. Well, not quite double, but you increase it greatly by adding women to the workforce. Well, anytime you add a novel population of the workforce, the value of labor goes down. Now, you also have the sexual revolution, and there are some feminists who are now positing the idea that marriage was an institution devised by a tyrannical patriarchy for the enslavement of women. And so it is in this second wave of feminism that you begin to have pushing towards legalization of abortion and also an equal rights amendment that would remove legal distinction between men and women in terms of labor, in terms of military service, in terms of divorce, in terms of all aspects of law. That's actually going to spark a counterculture or a conservative movement later on in the 70s. So here you have Catherine Switzer, who's being taken off the field for running in the Boston Marathon. And you have this idea, and this is something else that modern humans sort of take for granted. There have been several times, okay. Sexual mores have been governed by state governments in the United States since the colonial days. There had been a very large corpus of law, all of which doesn't get peeled back until 2003. So there had been states where adultery was considered a crime against the state. So stepping out on your spouse was considered a crime against the state. Sodomy was considered a crime against the state, where any sort of non-conventional sex was seen as a crime against the state. And so one of the things that begins to emerge is this idea that what one does in one's home is not any of the state's business. Now, that's what you're going to read when you get into Griswold versus Connecticut, where they're first arguing it about birth control, and then later that becomes the predicate for Roe v. Wade, which permits abortion. You have the Stonewall raids in 1969, which is the beginning of your gay liberation movement. And then also you have Chicano activism in the American Southwest with the farm workers movement and with LULAC and with La Raza. And also the natives engage in a protest to protest their station in both reservation life and in the historical and their historical treatment. So this is an image of Dolores Huerta and Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, of course, will be assassinated in 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel. This is the Red Power icon, and here is when the native protesters occupied Alcatraz Island. So the Supreme Court hands down a number of decisions that radically transform American life and in many ways infringe upon traditional state prerogatives. So one of the things that, one example of this, besides Griswold, which set the sort of predicate what one does in one's home is one's own business, was the case of Loving versus Virginia. The Loving family was an interracial family in the state of Virginia, where the state of Virginia maintained on its books laws against mixed race relations. They also laid down a court case imposing restrictions on the police. So you have Miranda versus Arizona, which is why when one is arrested, one is read one's Miranda rights, the right to remain silent, the right to counsel, where the expectation is that the rights be read to you by the arresting officer before anything further is made, or it's inadmissible. One of the things that's also kind of interesting is now you have the addition of the person has to have their rights read to them in such a way that they understand, not just necessarily in the first tongue of the arresting officer. And so this is why typically they will prompt a person being arrested, do you understand the rights as I've read to you? The other thing that you have had, and you have Engel versus Vitale, which removed many forms of public religious practice from the schools. So for example, in the 1950s, it was not at all unusual for the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father prayer, to be read over the public address during the instructional day. So when you hear about people complaining about prayer being taken out of school, that's the case of Engel versus Vitale. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about it is whereas previous iterations of the Supreme Court, you don't necessarily get rulings that reach into the individual's lives or reach into the whole nation. Typically, most of your court rulings are like, this law that was passed by this state on this matter is constitutional or it's not. Again, a lot of the body that we had read about when it came to court cases in, say, the New Deal or even the 1920s had to do with business law and how they conducted business. It didn't affect how individual people lived their lives. And perhaps the most controversial extension of privacy was the case of Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade had, in its decision, established the idea that the Constitution protected a right to an abortion, which, again, it's predicated on the legal theory of privacy, and as many scholars would point out, it's a bit of a stretch. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was on the Supreme Court until she died recently, said Roe was problematic because it ended the debate on abortion, rather than if you look at other reform movements where the reform takes place state by state. Here you have a national court ruling, and it just imposes the solution whether or not the body politic agreed. And of course, Roe would be overturned in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Health, which I'm hoping we get to in the last week, but no promises, because that's where we start getting a little too close to current events. Okay. This is a picture of the Loving family. Okay, so 1968, which is an election year, is literally the year all sorts of terrible things break loose. Starts with the Tet Offensive in January. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King and the ensuing race riots in April. You have the death of Robert Kennedy Jr. in June. And with LBJ announcing in March he wasn't running for re-election, and Bobby Kennedy, the presumed heir apparent, dying in June before the convention, the Democratic convention was in chaos as the party bosses elected Hubert Humphreys, again, a good machine politician, much to the chagrin of the New Left and the social protest movement, causing there to be riots outside the Democratic convention in Chicago in 1968. And there was plenty more. Also, let's see if I have this image. So here you have strike workers in Tennessee protesting after around the time King was assassinated. Here we have Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who, after winning their event in the 1968 Summer Olympics, raised their fists in the Black Power salute during the national anthem. This was readily a national embarrassment. Sort of a fun and awkward fact, the third place guy right here, if you look carefully, this is a right hand and this is a left hand. They actually belong to, I remember reading somewhere, it's this guy gave him the gloves. But no, it was a national embarrassment on the world stage when Olympics is also used to project strength, especially in the context of the Cold War. And so after much turmoil in 1968, you not only have turmoil among the youth of the baby boom here, you also have it among the youth and the racially oppressed in the other great colonial powers in England, in France, in other parts of Europe. And into this chaos, people sought a sense of normalcy. And so with the Democratic Party coalition falling apart and the Republicans having gotten shellacked in 1964, the Republican Party coalesces around the familiar face of Richard Nixon, who was the vice president in the good old days of We Like Ike. And so in 1968, you have a three-way election with with George Wallace, a openly avowed segregationist candidate, taking electors from the South. You have the Democratic Party without the South losing the electoral college and being under on the popular vote. They're carrying mostly New England. Yes, they carry Texas, But again, the usual suspects of the Deep South don't follow along. Nixon carries parts of the South, the Midwest, and the Far West, with the exception of Oregon. Now, what's ironic is Nixon will get the United States out of the Vietnam War, which is what the protest movement wanted. However, Nixon's way of getting the United States out of the Vietnam War is not what the protest movement wanted. And so in the next module, we're going to get into the Nixon years and the rise of conservative movements in American politics. But this is the transformational year. This is the year that the Democratic Party loses the South, and that realignment begins where you have where the evangelical conservatives move into the Republican Party. And so I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions, please message me in Canvas.